Some kind of confined space, a vat, boiler, silo, tunnel, tank, or pipeline can be found in over 240,000 workplaces. And every year, over 1.5 million workers enter these areas to do a variety of tasks, from inspection and testing of equipment to welding, painting, and maintenance. Many of these workers are well equipped and have some general knowledge and training on the hazards that can be found in confined spaces. However, it isn't until you get inside a confined space that you really feel the effects of all that preparation. At this point, it's pretty comforting to know that all those safety checks are in place, that you're familiar with the equipment and clothing, and that a well-trained attendant is following your every move. Working in such potentially dangerous areas is tricky business. In these situations, it is essential that you understand the hazards and that you're well equipped and properly trained. And most importantly, you must be able to make the right decision if conditions change. This video is your guide to the new OSHA regulation. We'll review the requirements of the standard and look at what it means to those who work in confined spaces. In addition to the 1.6 million workers who actually enter confined spaces each year, the standard covers another 10.6 million people who work at places where confined spaces exist. Before we examine the requirements of the standard, we'll look at a few definitions, plus the risks associated with confined spaces. To begin, here are 4 key definitions that are vitally important. One, confined space. OSHA defines a confined space as large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. In addition, a confined space has limited or restricted means for entry or exit and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. This could mean small, narrow, or cramped passageways, or that entry or exit is by means of a ladder, or that other equipment in the space may make evacuation and rescue difficult. Some common confined spaces include tanks, boilers, ducts, reactor vessels, furnaces, utility manholes, vaults, bins, hoppers, pits, crawl spaces, and scrubbers, and any other area that may have limited means of entry. 2. Permit-required confined space, or permit space, is a confined space that has or may have one or more of the following characteristics. Contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. This could mean that the oxygen content of the space is inadequate, or that toxic or explosive gases, fumes, or vapors are present. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. For example, a bin filled with sawdust is an engulfment hazard. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. Contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard, such as turning exposed blades on equipment or a hole where a worker could drop through to another level. In other words, a permit space contains hazards that make it dangerous to enter without taking special precautions. These spaces are considered a health and safety risk. 3. An entry means the action by which a person passes through an opening into a permit-required confined space. Entry includes all work activities done in that space and is considered to have occurred as soon as any part of the entrant's body breaks the plane of an opening into the space. 4. An entry permit is the written or printed document that is provided by the employer to allow and control entry into a permit space and that contains the information specified by this section. We'll talk more about the entry permits in a few minutes. The main goal of the standard is to protect workers from the hazards associated with confined spaces. We know from accident reports that hazardous atmospheres account for most of the deaths and injuries in confined spaces. These atmospheres can be either asphyxiating, toxic, or explosive. Contaminated atmospheres, asphyxiation, or suffocation account for nearly half of all confined space deaths. Normally, the air we breathe contains 20.9% oxygen. When the oxygen level falls below 19.5%, there is an asphyxiation danger. Any number of things can cause the oxygen level to fall. For example, the chemical reaction of metal oxidation or rust uses up oxygen. Metal oxidation is a common finding in tank cleaning operations because the chemicals in the cleanser often react with the wall of the tank. Oxygen can also be replaced by other gases. For example, if a vessel has been used to transport nitrogen, the oxygen supply may be inadequate. Oxygen is also used up when flammable materials burn, for example, during welding or flame cutting operations. Even a simple repair or cleanup job can reduce the amount of oxygen available. For this reason, oxygen levels should be monitored continuously. However, the toxic effect of certain gases, vapors, or fumes may occur regardless of the oxygen level. The most common toxic materials found in permit spaces are carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide smells like a rotten egg. Unfortunately, the fumes dull the sense of smell and may cause you to believe the danger is gone. Carbon monoxide, on the other hand, has no odor and must be detected with a monitor. The combination of a flammable gas, vapor, or dust, oxygen, and an ignition source within a confined space can produce a very dangerous atmosphere. A flammable atmosphere might contain methane or acetylene gases, solvent or fuel vapors, or coal or grain dust. All that may be needed is a spark from a tool or static electricity to cause an explosion. As always, it's a good idea to have material safety data sheet information available at all times on any substances found in a confined space. The MSDS will help you identify the hazards of the substance. Confined space accidents and deaths can also occur if energy sources have not been properly secured and isolated from the space. Before confined space work can begin, all valves and electrical equipment must be properly locked out according to the OSHA lockout-tagout regulation. All connecting pipes should be blanked off, separated, or sealed. Pipelines must be flushed, drained, and isolated as well to prevent unexpected exposure to contaminants. Other safety considerations include heat stress, falls from ladders or railings, falling objects, wet surfaces, noise, and becoming wedged in a narrow part of the structure. Now we'll look at how the permit-required confined space standard will help control these risks. Under this standard, all confined spaces must be evaluated, and those areas that are classified as permit-required spaces must be clearly identified. All employees who work in or near permit spaces must be informed of their location and potential danger. Unauthorized entries must also be prevented. Danger signs or any other effective means can be used to identify and warn workers of permit spaces. In some cases, barriers may be used. In any event, the employer must make sure that whatever measures are taken clearly warn employees of permit space dangers and prevent unauthorized entry. If it is necessary for workers to enter permit spaces as part of their job, the employer is required to develop and carry out a written permit space entry program. This program must cover identification and control of confined space hazards and procedures for entering permit spaces. Since all permit spaces have different shapes and hazards, OSHA has included a list of general control measures that can help ensure safe entry. These control measures include, but are not limited to, the following. 1. Specifying acceptable entry conditions. This ensures that the hazards have been identified and that acceptable limits have been set. These conditions must be met before entry is permitted. 2. Isolate the permit space. This includes the use of proper lockout-tagout procedures to control electrical and mechanical hazards. 3. Purge, flush, and/or ventilate the space to bring the hazards under control. 4. Use barriers to prevent unauthorized personnel from entering. Barriers also serve to protect the workers inside from any disturbance that could be caused by the movements of people or objects outside. 5. Atmospheric testing and monitoring. The environment inside the space must be checked and monitored to assure that entry conditions are acceptable. Oxygen content should be checked first, then combustible gases and vapors, followed by toxic gases and vapors. All workers with active roles in and around permit spaces must be given the proper training and equipment. These employees include authorized entrants, entry supervisors, attendants, and rescue personnel. Equipment needed for permit space entry could include any or all of the following: testing and monitoring devices, ventilating equipment, self-contained breathing apparatus, communication devices, personal protective equipment, proper lighting, barriers and shields, and ladders. It is the employer's responsibility to provide this equipment and to keep it in proper working order. Rescue equipment may also be necessary unless it is supplied by outside rescue services. According to the new permit space standard, an attendant must be stationed outside of a permit space as long as an authorized entrant remains inside. It is the attendant's job to control and monitor all entry operations and to maintain ongoing communication with authorized entrants. If the only risk to entrance is a hazardous atmosphere that can be eliminated by purging or ventilating, attendance may not be required. Purging and ventilating cleans the air within the permit space so that it is safe for employees to breathe. In other words, the atmosphere is no longer hazardous to health and life. Strict entry procedures, however, must still be followed. Since rescue attempts account for over 60% of all confined space fatalities, there must be a plan for an emergency service to rescue entrants and provide care to those who need it. These rescue procedures must be in place before any permit space entries can occur. The emergency plan must also prevent untrained but well-intentioned workers from going into a confined space to try to rescue a fallen coworker. Rescue or emergency services may be situated on-site or off-site, depending upon which method is more appropriate for the particular workplace. On occasion, independent contractors are used in permit space work projects. When contractors are hired, it is the host employer's responsibility to make sure that the contractor is informed about the permit spaces and related hazards, as well as the entry procedures and precautions. To ensure that all elements of the permit space program are effective, the procedures must be reviewed at least annually and revised as needed. As part of the overall confined space program, a permit system must be in place. This system defines how permits are prepared, issued, and canceled. The entry permit itself must contain the following information: the job site, why the space is being entered, the date and time period of the permit, names or other means of identifying those who enter, names of attendants and entry supervisor, permit space hazards, measures used to isolate, remove, or reduce confined space hazards. These methods include lockout procedures, purging, ventilating, or flushing. Acceptable entry conditions. All test results and the name or initials of the tester. The name of the rescue service and how to contact it. The communication system to be used between the attendant and the entrant. All equipment needed for entry. Other information needed to ensure worker safety, and any other additional approvals issued for work in the confined space. An example may be a permit granted for hot work. Now, here's a look at how a typical entry permit is used. Before anyone can enter a permit space, the entry permit must be signed by the entry supervisor. This signature confirms that all safety procedures have been reviewed and that the space can be entered safely. Next, the permit must be posted or in some way made available to those who enter the space. This confirms that all pre-entry safety checks have been completed and identifies the hazards associated with the permit space. The permit is issued only for the length of time that it takes to complete the job listed. Then, when the assigned task is completed, the permit is canceled by the entry supervisor. History shows that one of the major factors contributing to confined space fatalities and injuries has been the entrant's lack of awareness that the air in a confined space might be hazardous or even lethal. Likewise, many of those who tried to rescue a fallen coworker did not understand the hazards involved or the procedures required for safe entry and rescue. Because of this, training of permit space workers is required. All those who will actually enter confined spaces, as well as all attendants, entry supervisors, and rescue team workers, must be trained. This training must be completed before a worker can be assigned a permit space job duty. Training must also be done before any changes in work assignment are made or whenever a new hazard causes a change in the permit space operations. If a worker has already been trained in the new duties or procedures, extra training is not required, as long as the employer believes the worker knows how to perform the appropriate permit space procedures. Training can also be required if an employer feels that entry procedures are not being followed or if a worker does not appear to have the skills needed to safely do the job. The potential hazards of working in a confined space are many. It is essential that all of you who work in confined spaces be aware of the hazards and the required safety procedures and how to use the protective equipment provided by your employer. The permit-required confined space standard is an excellent tool to help you better understand and function safely in your workplace. It provides guidelines for pre-entry checks and a well-defined process to maintain contact between entrants and attendants. By carefully following these rules, you can work safely, even in permit-required confined spaces.